Hello, my name is Timothy Caulfield, and I'm a professor of health and science policy at the University of Alberta. I'm an author. I do work in the media, and I research misinformation. And holy cow, has there ever been a lot of misinformation over the past couple years. It is absolutely everywhere. And as I'm going to argue today, I think that fighting misinformation is one of the defining issues of our time. It's something that I've believed for a long time, but what's really interesting is increasingly the general public is believing this also. This was a study that came out very recently, as you can see, that found that 95% of Americans believe that the spread of misinformation is a serious issue. In Canada, they did a similar study, and they found that 96% of Canadians admit that they see misinformation on the daily. This is a huge, huge issue. But the real question is, can we do anything about it? And the answer, of course, is yes, we can. In fact, this event that you're participating in is one of the things that we need to do. We need to talk to the general public. We need to have these kinds of dialogues. But we can do more. We can do so much more. As I said, I study misinformation, and I've been doing it for decades. And before the pandemic, I used to study stuff like this: the marketing of unproven therapies. This, of course, is Kim Kardashian. She's getting a vampire facial. Have you guys heard of this? The vampire facial. They actually stick needles in your face and then inject blood. We actually filmed a woman doing this. I do not recommend it. It's not a good idea. But this is the kind of stuff I studied before the pandemic. I also looked at unproven therapies like this: people drinking their own urine. Have you guys heard about this? Drinking their own pee. Again, not a good idea, and they're doing it because I think it's going to help them live longer. If you think this is disgusting, look at this: a woman drinking her dog's pee, her dog's urine. Again, not a good idea. I love this headline, by the way. This therapy prevents cancer and acne, so it's very, very powerful. But we have these kinds of unproven therapies, this kind of misinformation circulating in popular culture, and it's been there for a very long time. Layer on top of that all the noise about health that we've heard for a long time, including things like going gluten-free, or that you have to get your genes tested, or you have to take all of these supplements. We have long lived in a very chaotic information environment, an extremely chaotic information environment. But now we have stuff like this. Since the pandemic, we have absolutely absurd information, things like the idea that taking the vaccine will make you magnetic. Was that misinformation in Portugal? Did that come here? Yeah, completely ridiculous. We have this kind of stuff. We have this kind of stuff. You know, in the United States, the former national security advisor to the president telling people that the vaccine is in salad dressing. You know, completely absurd. So yes, we have heard a lot of misinformation over the past year and a half. As I said, this is my area. It has been absolutely bonkers. We've heard misinformation about where it came from. We hear misinformation about cures. We are really living in the middle of what's been called an infodemic. This is a term that was coined by the World Health Organization in January of 2020, and I think it's a term that really captures what's going on. This is a term that says this is about the spread of misinformation, and it spreads like a disease, and it does real harm. In fact, I think it is fair to say that misinformation is killing people, and we have to figure out how to stop it. I like this cartoon. Came out very, very recently because it really speaks to the degree to which misinformation is, as I said earlier, becoming one of the defining issues of our time. And it's something that we're going to have to grapple with even after the pandemic. So today, that was all a big lead up to what I want to talk about today with you. I don't have a lot of time. I can't cover everything. I want to talk about the nature of the misinformation that is out there right now, the nature of the misinformation in the context of COVID. I want to talk about how it got here. You know, why is misinformation so bad? But what I really want to land on is what the evidence says that we can do. What does the evidence tell us about how we should respond as individuals, as institutions, as a society? How should we respond? Okay, so let's get started. This is a photograph I took not that long ago at my local grocery store. I was checking out, and as I was checking out, I see one of those, those magazines that are right by the checkout, and this is the headline, and my head just about explodes. Now, no one really takes these newspapers seriously, but these headlines still matter, right? They represent the normalization of misinformation about a very serious topic. It washes over us, this misinformation, and does have an impact on our beliefs. Then, of course, there's more serious bits of misinformation in connection to the COVID vaccine, like the top one, the idea that vaccines will impact your fertility. I'm sure you guys have heard this one, right? Incredibly common bit of misinformation, and one that we know is having an impact on beliefs and behaviors. A second really common one that I'm still seeing is the idea that the vaccine will change your DNA, right? No evidence to support that. It's not even scientifically plausible. But again, it's information that is having a real impact. And again, lots of misinformation about therapies. Another example, another headline, this anti-vax family is drinking their own urine. They're against vaccines, but they're okay with drinking their own pee. Urine really did have a big year. People are drinking their own urine, they're drinking dog urine, and they're drinking cow urine. No, don't do any of that. But this kind of misinformation matters. It has an impact. It really does. How much of an impact? Well, I love this research from the United States, and this has also been done in Canada, because I think it really highlights, as I said earlier, the normalization of misinformation. Why am I so obsessed with this? Because the Bill Gates conspiracy theory is a pretty hardcore conspiracy theory. Have you guys heard it? This is the idea that Bill Gates started the pandemic, right, in order to force vaccination, so he could put microchips in us. Never mind that we all carry supercomputers around. We don't need a microchip in us for Bill Gates to find us. But look at those numbers. 28% of Americans believe the Bill Gates conspiracy theory. Other studies have put it at 20%, and other studies at 27%, a very recent one. And the reason I highlight this is, you have to be careful not to overinterpret survey research like this. But I think it highlights a significant portion of the population is at least open, right? Is at least open to a pretty hardcore conspiracy theory. And again, really demonstrating sort of the normalization of misinformation. There's been other studies done in the United States that have found that about 50% of the country believes at least one of the big COVID conspiracies. In my own country of Canada, pretty similar numbers. This is a study done by a colleague of mine, Josh Greenberg, at Carleton University, and they found about 46% of Canadians believe, again, at least one of the big COVID conspiracy theories. So, the Bill Gates conspiracy theory, or the 5G conspiracy theory. Have you guys heard that one? The idea that COVID was caused by 5G technology? Again, no, and it's not even scientifically plausible, but a significant portion of the population believes it. And unfortunately, you guys, there's also evidence that tells us that things are getting worse with just the volume of misinformation out there. So this was an analysis that was in the New York Times in August, so not that long ago. And it found that misinformation about the idea that vaccines don't work since the Delta variant really started taking up over 400%. Misinformation about microchips, the Bill Gates thing, up over 150%. Misinformation about natural immunity, this is a complex one. There's all this noise out there, up over 100%. And misinformation about infertility and miscarriages, up over 75%. So the noise is out there, and it's unfortunately expanding and doing real damage. Okay, so where does the misinformation come from? How did we get here? You guys probably know the answer, but I'm going to say it anyway. There's a growing body of evidence that tells us that this is largely, not entirely, but largely a social media phenomenon. Yes, this is an area that we've been studying for a long time. Yes, the misinformation is in the conventional news media. Yes, there's misinformation you hear from your friends and neighbors, etc. But this is really largely a phenomenon that is built on the back of social media. And I think there's a robust body of evidence that supports this conclusion. They've looked at it from a variety of methodological perspectives. And just consider this one study. This was a study that came out very recently again, and actually a colleague at the University of Alberta did this. Tried to put a number on where the misinformation started, and as you can see, they concluded 85% of it starts on social media. And they put a lot of blame on Facebook, as you can see in that study. Other studies have found different conclusions, but the general theme is almost always the same. Almost always the same. And we can go even further. It's a social media problem, and it's largely, not entirely, but largely an American social media phenomenon. I should rephrase that. The American social media platforms are probably doing the most damage. The past study I referred to, and some other studies have said the United States, India, Brazil, those are some of the countries, and Spain, where there's a lot of misinformation. But the important thing that this study found was that misinformation from the United States, crosses the borders and permeates our public discourse. And that's really important to know because it highlights how hard it can be to stop misinformation, number one. But number two, it really also highlights how the rhetoric from the United States, which is very polarized, you guys know that, can have an impact on all of us. So it's a social media phenomenon, and it comes largely from these polarized conversations. This was another interesting study that came out from McGill last summer. Again, not surprising, but good to have the data. And there have been other studies that have replicated this kind of work. But basically, they found that if you get your news from a social media platform, Facebook, Twitter, Instagram, TikTok, you're more likely to believe misinformation, more likely to spread misinformation, right? Again, really important to know if we're going to think about how we're going to push back against this noise. And as I said, there have been a number of other studies, many studies actually, that have supported this conclusion. And then there's this, and you could give a whole talk on this issue, and that is the challenge of the algorithms that shape our information reality. So when you go to Facebook, when you go to Instagram, when you go to Twitter, there are algorithms that have an impact on what you are going to see. This was in an analysis that came out just a couple months ago that found that those algorithms, despite all the concern about misinformation, continue to push it in our faces. We've done research on this ourselves and have found that our search engines, so you go to Google, if you Google something, a great portion of what you get back is misinformation. Your search engines really do create your information universe. And so that's why this, I think, is really, really problematic. And look at this analysis I contributed to. This one, again, came out very, very recently. So much going on in this space, you guys, right now. They found that even platforms like Amazon, when you go and you search something, those algorithms continue to put misinformation in your face. And so what they found was that you put in the word, searching for something on vaccines, and almost all the books they recommend are hardcore anti-vax books. Now, I've actually tried this, and I got the same thing. I mean, really hardcore, like not, just people asking questions, really hardcore. anti-vax books. So that's what people are exposed to, and that's one of the reasons that misinformation spreads. Now, one of the areas that I do a lot of research in and I'm very fascinated in is the role of popular culture and celebrities. You know, are prominent individuals, are celebrities playing a big role in the COVID misinformation space? So are celebrities part of the problem here? And you could probably guess the answer. The answer is, but let's start with a positive. Let's start with a positive first. We are starting to see, I don't know if this is happening in Portugal, how much is happening in Europe, but we are starting to see celebrities step up and recommend getting vaccinated. Now, this may seem frivolous and may seem like it doesn't have an impact, but it is a good idea because celebrities, prominent individuals, can help normalize the behavior. This is one of the constructive roles of pop culture. It's not all bad. Celebrities aren't all bad. They can help to normalize things. They can help to normalize diseases. They can help to normalize a variety of different kinds of lifestyles. That's a constructive role that celebrity culture can play. Here's another example of that. This was a study that came out in February. Do you guys remember when Tom Hanks, I don't know if it was news over here, but when Tom Hanks got COVID, was it news here? So he was one of the first big celebrities to get COVID, North American celebrities to get COVID, and it was big news. And these researchers found that was a good thing because, again, it helped to normalize the idea of COVID. It made it feel real. So yes, celebrities can play a constructive role, but let's get to the bad stuff because celebrities can also do a lot of damage. And let's start with my friend, Gwyneth Paltrow. So I don't know if you guys knew this, but Gwyneth Paltrow has long COVID. Have you heard that? She allegedly has long COVID. So, and if that's true, Gwyneth, I hope you get better soon. I don't wish that on anyone. But Gwyneth Paltrow used this diagnosis as an opportunity to sell stuff, right? She used the fear and uncertainty around long COVID to sell unproven products, to sell essential oils and a dieting pattern and supplements, her brand, a Goop brand supplements, of course, all this nonsense. So that's really infuriating. You know, as I said, she's using fear and uncertainty and even sympathy for her, right? She's leveraging that in order to sell products, which is really infuriating. But one of the things I really like about this headline is that the National Health Service called her out, right? They said this isn't true, this is dangerous. I'd like to see more of that, you know, more regulators, policymakers, even if they're not taking regulatory action, actually calling out these celebrities. Here's another very recent example. So, is Nicki Minaj big here? People know who Nicki Minaj is? Okay, people are saying, you know, a little bit, okay. Nicki Minaj recently, was this a story here? Nicki Minaj sends out a tweet that says that, now I'm not sure, her friend's cousin's testicles became enlarged as a result of the vaccine. Did you guys hear this? Was this a news story here? And it was huge. It blew up, right? It blew up, really highlighting how a single story, true or not, from a celebrity can have an impact on how people talk about an important issue. So absolutely, celebrities, prominent individuals, shaping public discourse, having an impact. Woody Harrelson, do you guys know Woody Harrelson? He was one of the epicenters for the 5G myth. I don't know if you guys knew that. Woody Harrelson and the singer MIA, do you know MIA from the UK? I used to love her, but not anymore because she's pushing misinformation. Yeah, they're having a lot of having an impact. Look at this interesting study that came out of Oxford. Now, this study came out at the beginning of the pandemic, and since this study, there have been bigger ones, but I really like this straightforward methodology these researchers used. And basically what they did is they looked at hundreds of bits of misinformation and tried to get a sense where it came from. And you can see they found that 20% of all that misinformation they looked at had as its origin story, as its start, a prominent individual, right? So a celebrity, a sports star, a politician. So that's a pretty big hunk in itself, right? 20% of all the, has prominent individuals as sort of the starting point. But look at the next line. 69% of what's circulating on social media is all of us, right? The general public sharing that bunk from the prominent individual. So I think it's a really good example of how this is a top-down, bottom-up phenomenon, and more importantly, it speaks to what we need to do to fight the misinformation. Here's another example of another study that makes that same point even more dramatically. So this was a study that was done at Cornell University, and they looked at, I think it was 1.1 million bits of news and circulating in pop culture about COVID. And they came to the conclusion that 37.9% of all the misinformation out there had some connection to the former president, Donald Trump, right? There was some mention of Donald Trump, which is astounding, right? And that led to this headline in the New York Times saying that he's the single greatest source of misinformation. I don't know if that's true, but again, it makes the point that study from Oxford did. This is really a top-down, bottom-up phenomenon. The other really interesting thing from this study is they found that only 16.4% of all that misinformation that they looked at was debunked, was fact-checked, was countered. You know, we got to get that number up. That's too low. That's too low. We've got to do better. The other thing this study did, and this is the kind of stuff we do at our institute, and I agree with their conclusions here. They looked at, they tried to do sort of a topography of the kind of misinformation that is out there. You can see number one is miracle cures. I don't think the miracle cures get enough attention. They're starting to. Then you got sort of your classic kind of conspiracy theory stuff, right? 5G, Bill Gates, right? Then you've got number 10. Has everyone seen number 10? This is that documentary, The Plandemic. I bet you almost everyone here, I don't know how this translates in Portuguese, has probably heard the word plandemic. Am I right? Has everyone? No, people haven't? So Plandemic was a documentary that came out early in the COVID crisis. And it basically is a string of conspiracy theories, but it got a huge amount of attention. Just an absolute huge amount of attention, to the point that, as these researchers found, it was one of the most discussed kinds of misinformation in pop culture. One documentary called The Plandemic. And I'm going to come back to that, because I think this is a really overlooked source of misinformation. And that's these videos, these fake documentaries, these doctors making little fake interviews, and then people share them. They do real damage. This is another example. This is a group called, one of the leaders of a group called America's Frontline Doctors. Have you guys heard of this group? They do a huge amount of damage. They spread misinformation about hydroxychloroquine and vaccines and Ivermectin. And as you can see here, this was a talk from not that long ago where she's saying that all the public health measures are a crime against humanity. But just to give you a sense of the kind of individual this is, she was arrested, this woman here, she was arrested for her role in the Capitol insurrection, right? So that gives you an idea of who she's hanging out with, what her kind of credibility is. But these kinds of documentaries do real harm. But let's get back to The Plandemic. So this is a documentary, and I don't recommend watching it. I watched it for you. It was really, really painful. It basically is just a string of conspiracy theories put together in a very slick-looking documentary. The New York Times wanted to get a sense of how much pop culture traction it actually got. And you can see here that the New York Times found that The Plandemic outperformed Taylor Swift, right? You're having an impact when you outperform Taylor Swift. So that gives you a sense of the play that these kinds of documentaries get. So why is that? Why do documentaries have so much impact? And I think it's a really important thing to look at, for when you're thinking about how we can do good science communication. Well, I actually make documentaries. And so I'm fascinated by this. One of the things they found, this was a study that came out last summer, and may seem obvious, but good to have the data. They found that slickness, that production value matters, right? If you make it look slick, you make it look fancy, that adds to the credibility. Again, that may seem obvious, but it's important to know that, right? Because as I'm going to say at the end here, creativity wins. We have to be creative too. These people who are pushing misinformation are being creative. It makes it look credible. It makes it look persuasive. How persuasive? Look at this study. This was a study where they showed these kinds of documentaries to health science students. So you would think these science students would have on their critical thinking caps, right? And they found, even for this audience, these kind of documentaries can be persuasive, which is really, really depressing. What kind of documentaries did they show? Stuff like this. The documentary What the Health and The Game Changers. Was this popular? These two documentaries popular? Yeah. In Portugal, they're on Netflix. There's always a little bit of science involved. The production value is beautiful. Sometimes there's famous people involved. But the thing I want to really highlight here, why I think these documentaries are so persuasive, is they almost always have narratives. They almost always have stories. They almost always have someone going on a journey. And we know a powerful anecdote, a powerful story can be incredibly persuasive. This was a study from 2016 that found that anecdotes, stories, testimonials can overwhelm our ability to think scientifically. We've done studies on this ourselves in the context of marketing unproven therapies and found exactly this. It's a very common marketing tool. Use a testimonial, use an anecdote. And that's exactly what's happening right now, where there are testimonials back to Nicki Minaj and her cousin's friend's testicles. Nicki Minaj tweet was a little story. It was a little anecdote that was scary, right? It was scary. And we'll remember Nicki Minaj's friend's cousin's testicles and not the hundreds of millions of data points about the safety and efficacy of these vaccines, right? Really highlighting how anecdotes, testimonials can be so persuasive. And let me give you an example of how anti-vaxxers use this information. Now, do not go to this website. Please do not go to this website. But in North America, this is a very popular, I think in the English-speaking world, this is a very popular website. It's called 1000 COVID Stories. And it is basically people uploading YouTube clips of them describing their adverse reactions to the vaccines. These have not been verified. They haven't dealt with the correlation-causation problem, which is huge when you're trying to tease out adverse events in the context of vaccines. But as you can see, there are all these powerful stories, and that can be very, very persuasive, including Eric Clapton, the guitar player. Can you see him there? So, yes, anecdotes make a big difference. Okay, who believes this stuff? Who believes this stuff? I could give a whole talk on this. It's a very complex question, and I think it's really important off the top to highlight that there are individuals from absolutely every demographic in society that can be pulled in to the misinformation vortex. I think it's really important to recognize that. It can happen to anyone. Our information environment is just so chaotic and so polarized that it's easy to fall into this trap. But there are themes emerging. There have been a lot of studies recently on this. This was some research. One of my colleagues, Gordon Pennycook, is an author on this. And they found that, yes, education matters, right? It does matter. Yes, health literacy matters. Like events like this matter. Trust, a big issue, and that's a real challenge, I think. But also, I think the last point is really important. A lot of research has shown that beliefs cluster, right? So if you believe in alternative medicine, you're more likely to believe misinformation about COVID. You get this clustering of beliefs. If you think hydroxychloroquine is effective, you're more likely to believe ivermectin is effective. The beliefs cluster. That's another really, really common theme. Another important theme is this one. This is an interesting study that came out, again, I've said this a number of times, very recently, and it found that people who believe in conspiracy theories are less likely to revise their beliefs in the face of new evidence. Follow that? Whereas people who are more science-based, right, like the people who go to science festivals, we do revise our worldview when new evidence emerges, right? So the mask debate is a classic example of that. This is really important to recognize because that means that hardcore conspiracy theorists, it's very difficult to change their minds with new facts. The other thing I find fascinating about this, I get a lot of hate mail. People send me hate mail every day. I got some this morning, every day. And the first line in the hate mail is how much they hate me, what an idiot I am. And then the second line is always, Tim, you got to open your mind to 5G and hydroxychloroquine and ivermectin, which is very ironic because they don't open their mind, right? Their mind is ossified, it's set. Okay, the other thing that's going on, and this is very controversial, and I think this is becoming a dominant theme, is that ideology is playing a bigger and bigger role. This is a quote from last year, but I like it so much because I think it really captures what's going on. If you frame vaccine refusal as being part of ideology or civil rights, it allows the anti-vax person to sidestep the science. Follow that? It becomes about the ideology, about the rights language, and not about the science. And that is happening increasingly all over the world. All over the world, and there's been really interesting research on this phenomenon. This is tough. This is tough because if it's about ideology, it can be more difficult to change people's minds. This was another study that came out in the United States, and there have been others that have come to similar conclusions. We just did a study where we looked at Twitter Twitter conversations about hydroxychloroquine, and we found it was almost entirely about ideology. This study found that, if you are more conservative, you're more likely to fall for a particular kind of misinformation. Now, I want to be really careful here. I'm not picking on an ideology, because this happens across the ideological spectrum. The point I'm trying to make is that ideology matters, right, in the spread of misinformation. But in the context of COVID, especially in the United States, but in other countries too, conservative ideology is playing a big role. Twitter dominates discussions about fake news in the context of COVID. Our own study that just came out weeks ago, same conclusion. And we see even entities like Fox News pushing misinformation. Look at this study that came out, I think just weeks ago, maybe even just last week, where they found that if you get your news from a conservative station, you're more likely to believe that ivermectin is effective. And by the way, it's not. There's been clinical trials and systematic reviews that show it's not effective. Yes, we could keep doing more research on it, but we have no evidence to date, no good evidence to date to suggest it's effective in the context of COVID. But you can see the role from this study that ideology plays in this context. Okay, all right, so we've looked at examples of misinformation out there. We've got a sense of where it's coming from. It's largely a social media phenomenon. Algorithms matter. We've also got a sense of who believes this stuff, right? Who's pulled to this, to misinformation? How are we going to respond? What are we going to do about it? And this, of course, is what I want to leave you guys with. What are we going to do? Well, the first bit of advice is very straightforward, and I think it builds on what Jack said, the last speaker here. We all need to relax. I know this sounds obvious, but there's actually empirical evidence to back it up. We need to pause and take a step back from the noise. I really like this quote from a professor in psychology from Australia, where she suggests that, again, I know this is obvious, but it's important to remind ourselves of this. We need to take control of our information environment. We need to recognize the cognitive biases that have an impact on what we all see, right? Let's take control of that information environment before it takes control of us. And of course, we also need to work with the social media platforms. Real change isn't going to happen unless we get them involved. Yes, we need to work with the regulators. The regulators that are regulating both the individuals that are selling bunk products, but also the healthcare providers that are pushing misinformation. So we need good policy. We need the regulators involved. We need the social media platforms to do more. We've got to teach critical thinking. Events like this really do matter. But I want to praise the idea of debunking. We all need to get out there and we need to debunk more. The good news is debunking does work. Countering misinformation does work. It may not feel like it. But there have been a lot of studies that have demonstrated this reality. This study came out last summer. There's been a lot since then. We've done our own work on it. I have a literature review where but I agree with this conclusion. The reality is there is cause for optimism. If we do it well, if we counter misinformation well, we can really make a difference, especially if experts are involved. But I think it's not just experts. The general public can be part of this debunking effort. This was a really recent study that I like very much. It came out just last month, where they found, the reason I like this one, it was international. It wasn't just North America, it wasn't just China, it wasn't just the UK, it was international. And they found that debunking, countering misinformation, fact-checking works regardless of the culture involved. So that is really great news. The other thing they found is they found no backfire effect. Have you heard of that? Backfire effect? This is the idea, the concern that if you debunk something, people will just become more entrenched in their views. Well, they found no backfire effect, and that is supported by other research. So the good news is debunking works. This is another study, again, very recent, done by two terrific researchers, and they found that not only does debunking work, people appreciate it. And this is good news for someone who does this all day long, because it doesn't feel like people appreciate it. But they found that people do appreciate it, they really value it, but they also see it as a public responsibility. The general public views countering misinformation as a public responsibility. I love that. I love that. Okay, what does a good debunk look like? You may be wondering, what kind of message do we need to counter misinformation? Well, this is a terrific study. It came out, I think, the summer of 2019, and it found very straightforward, you guys, very straightforward. You can say, it's Tim, that doesn't sound real. They found that providing good science, right? You provide the good science and you highlight the rhetorical tricks that are used to push misinformation. So what do I mean by that? You say, look, here's a systematic review about infertility. And by the way, you're using an anecdote, a testimonial, to push misinformation. You do that, and you do it well, you can make a difference. These are my 9 favorite, if you want to take a picture of this and share it with people, I would love it. These are my 9 favorite tips on how to craft a good debunk. As I said, you want to share the good science. You want to use good shareable content. What do I mean by that? Think about what it's going to look like on Twitter, on Facebook, on Instagram, on TikTok. I think number 4 is really important. Number 4 is important. Talk about the body of evidence. Talk about the scientific consensus. So often people who push misinformation, they cherry pick. They'll pick one study. Sometimes the study's retracted, or it's small, or it's an animal study or laboratory study. Always talk about the body of evidence, because that's what science is. It's never one study. It's always this body of evidence. And the other reason I like number 4 is it's an opportunity to talk about the scientific process, right? So body of evidence, and there have been a number of studies that have shown that is important. Number 5, really important, you want to listen. It can be hard. It can be really hard. You want to be humble. You want to be empathetic. Really, really important to have that empathy. Again, it can be hard. It can be hard, especially now when there's so much anger out there. But again, research tells us that matters. Number 6, so important. That's why I spent so much time on those documentaries. I always like to say, creativity wins. Being creative matters. You can make a difference by being creative. And we have research that tells us that we should be using humor. We should be using art. We should be using stories and narratives. We do that, we can make a difference. And events like this do exactly that, right? I've already said, highlight those rhetorical tricks. You want to make the fact, the truth, the memorable thing. And number 9, so important, always remember it's the general public, not those hardcore deniers, that's your audience. This picture was provided by the World Health Organization, but I love it because we're not going to convince these people, right? That woman holding the medical fascism sign, we're not going to convince her. We're not going to change her mind. This is who she is, right? As this chart highlights, again, from the World Health Organization, it would take a lot of energy to change her mind, right? So what we want to do is we want to focus on the general public. For the World Health Organization, their 2 rules for debunking are remember the general public as your target audience, and number 2, use good facts and highlight those rhetorical tricks used to push misinformation. This is the last study I want to highlight, but it's another good news study. Again, my colleague Gordon Pennycook, he's on our research grant looking at misinformation. He's a terrific, he's been doing a lot of really interesting research. And his colleague David Rand at MIT, they came up with this study, which by the way has been replicated in other laboratories. And they found, first of all, most people want to be accurate. They don't want to spread misinformation. They don't have a malevolent agenda to spread misinformation. People want to be accurate. So if we can just nudge them to pause, to reflect, to kind of embrace accuracy, they're less likely to spread misinformation, less likely to believe misinformation. It sounds very, very straightforward, but that's a great message, right? We can just even remind ourselves of that, right? Let's just pause. If I'm feeling emotional about this headline or this tweet, remind yourself to pause. But the other reason it's good news is this might be a scalable intervention, something that we can encourage populations to do. And Gordon and his colleagues are trying to do exactly that. This is our initiative. #ScienceUpFirst. We started it in January, and it's been a huge success, I believe. Hundreds of millions of interactions. And the goal is to counter misinformation on social media, right? To go and specifically go where the misinformation is, right? And trying to counter it on social media. So we're on Twitter, we're on Facebook, we're on Instagram, we're on TikTok. Come be part of the Science Up First team. We'd love to have you and share credible, fun, upbeat content that has been reviewed by independent experts. So come be part of the Science Up team. I'm going to end there with a really big thank you for the opportunity to come to beautiful Lisbon to talk to you about what I think is a really important topic. And I'll end with my 2 favorite words. Go science. Thank you very, very much.
Oeiras. 46 quilómetros quadrados de ideias e emoções com que damos forma ao futuro. Oeiras 27.